Several months ago, Vicki asked me to do a presentation on sin and grace. That gives me a lot of latitude, since that covers most of life, and it's an impossible topic to cover. So, first thing I'd like to do is put up a little spoiler alert here. What you're going to hear today, you're not going to learn much more than you know, but you're going to learn a lot more than you know, and it's all going to come together in a funny way. I'm thinking of this presentation as I'm going to give you the dots, and you get to connect them. I'm not a theologian, I'm really not a writer, but I have done a lot of visual work, a lot of photography, and a lot of publication work. And so my best way of working is with words and images. But making the connections is really your work. It's my work. I got a lot out of putting this thing together, but it was important for me to have you do your work too as you're going through this. So one of my heroes is Jenny Holzer, an artist who does very interesting work. I first met her on a park bench, namely her graphic arts at the Minnesota Art Museum, and she had these park benches around. And on it, there'd be a statement that said something. And I said, wow, that's neat. It's really true. And then the next line down said, oh, that's true, but it's different from the other. It's exactly the opposite of the other, and it's also true. So how do you balance the contradictions in our lives? And that's what sin and grace are. They're balance points, they're realities we have to deal with, they're realities that we try to make sense out of, but they're mysteries, and so it's pretty much impossible to make them come together. So that's your job, is to connect these dots that I'm going to give you today. And so what's more mysterious and opposite than sin and grace? Well, buckle up. Here we go. What do you see? Cool. I didn't see that in there, but it is cool, yes. Yeah, look at it for a while, and all of a sudden it pops. It's like that little thing you'll see on people's desks. There's these little squares and blank spaces and things like that, and if you look at it long enough, you say, oh, Jesus pops out. It's the same kind of a thing. We use, it's the negative spaces here that is evil, and the positive spaces are good. And so I like that as a little bit of a logo for what we're doing here on this topic of sin and grace. You can't talk about one without the other. Sin obviously makes no sense at all, and yet we spend our lives making sense out of it, trying to put our lives together in confession and making us whole again somehow or other. And evil does its best to negate that. So, quick pop quiz. I joined the Jesuits to be a high school teacher and never got to do that except for 3 years in training. And so during those 3 years, we'd always have a little pop quiz on what the topic was, what book we'd read or whatever. And so I'd like you to just, on a note, you got some paper in front of you or just in your mind, answer these questions real quick. What's the greatest sin or evil you can imagine? This is one of those dots. And the dots are going to be coming from you more than from me. But what's the greatest sin or evil you can imagine? I tested this out for myself. I made a list, and you're going to see them here in a second. But your list is going to be better than mine, or your list will flesh out mine, and no list will be complete. How have you encountered sin or evil in the world or personally? You know, we've all done it. It's on the news day in and day out. Occasionally it comes up in a homily. But we've encountered sin and evil in our lives. How is it that you've encountered? And what's the greatest evil that you can imagine? What's the biggest sin that you can think of? That's just what I've asked you to do. So what's the biggest sin you can think of? Well, I started playing with that, and here's the list I came up with. And I have a feeling you can get some bigger ones, some smaller ones, some more flabbergasting ones, some more frightening ones than any of these things on this list. So there was a few that came up with me. Anybody got one that's going to trump this list? Well, that might. Whoops, did I say that?
Not loving God.
Not loving God. Yes. And the clue there is not and loving going together. Those are the contradictions in one sense. And so look for those kinds of things that come up.
Despair.
Despair, certainly.
Not loving who I am and not loving someone else for who they are.
Right. So the love of self, not doing that, not loving someone for who they are, but love, the opposite, the shadow side of love, the places that I wanted to do it but screwed it up. Okay. What's the greatest evil? And I'm not going to get into today because I don't know that I can find the distinction between sin and evil. They're both and the same thing, different, here's what is the greatest evil you've experienced? I grew up in World War II. I was a little kid when Hiroshima was bombed. Met a person that I worked with in one of the programs that I worked with, a Japanese man who was in Nagasaki when the bomb fell and lived to be with me as we went to a memorial in Nagasaki and saw the picture of the B-29 bomber that dropped the bomb. And my dad worked for Boeing at the time. And so he said, how can we be in the same room? That's a contradiction in one sense. There's life there. Racism is just everywhere today. We've got our own take on that in this city. Slavery. I've been working on a slavery project for the last couple of years and looking at how Jesuits have enslaved people. And I'm sure most of you know some of our history in that, but that's an atrocious thing that we need to look at and are looking at. Hunger and famine and greed. Other evils that didn't make this list. Patty? Neglect. We can make this list up. That's what the rest of the presentation is kind of looking at these things. So, this is an interesting one. If it comes up. St. Vincent de Paul, we call him a saint, but at one point in his life he feared he was on the pathway to hell. Why? Because he could not name a single person among his acquaintances who was poor. Does that sound like an evil or a sin? Did it make your list? Sometimes we overlook some of the things. There's blind spots in our lives that we just miss. Well, Vincent de Paul was aware of that he overlooked, neglected the poor, and that became his life work, along with church administration and all of that. How many of you have the sin of idolatry on the list? I threw it on there because I had a nice little slide that's coming up here. So when you think of idolatry, what do you think of? You know, what came to mind for me was the worshiping of the golden calf in the desert. You know, how could anyone worship a golden calf? Well, it's not as strange as it might think. They were out there in the desert for a long time and nothing to eat but manna, which is evidently pretty bland, nourishing enough, but pretty bland. And you know, you get a good hankering for a steak on the grill, I would imagine. And it's pretty easy to see how I can focus on what I want at the moment. and turn it into some kind of an end, a God in my life. So idolatry and sin do happen. If I get these things to come up. But that idolatry is really when I'm looking for a value that leads to a dead end, as opposed to a value that leads me to freedom and life. And the journey that the people were on in the desert was leading them to life. But they wanted something more. They wanted something more specific. They wanted to limit that journey to what they wanted. Again, Jenny Holzer comes to mind. So Moses gave a list of things that gave us a list of things, or God gave us a list of things, or somehow or other this list of things came into our possession that gave us a lot of categories to talk about sins. And the Jewish people have been very much interested in the law that flows from the Ten Commandments and all other, I don't know the number, 600 and some other odd laws that were important. And sin was the breaking of those laws. And so, in one sense, if we get a clue of what the good value is we're seeking in the commandments, we're going to know what the value is we're looking for. So some of the categories we use, basically original sin, venial sin, mortal sin, personal sin, social sin. We make fine distinctions because we know that there's differences and they impact our lives. And so we like to make lists. Philosophers love to do that, and people that are teaching moral theology and catechists, and that's the way we introduce little kids to values. Do this, don't do that. And so, but it's the value we're after. So what's your best approach when thinking about sin? You know, I'm not looking for memorized answers from the Baltimore Catechism. I mean, I learned those and they got me through theology. That's a secret, but when I did my oral exam, theologians would ask me these big questions. I'd remember what I learned in 3rd grade and then paraphrase it. And it worked. This is just a little kind of a crazy footnote here. Somebody gave me this on a t-shirt the other day, and it says, technically Moses was the first person with a tablet downloading data from the cloud. Not bad. Pretty good data. But is it really good data, or is it crowd control for a bunch of unruly Israelites wandering in the desert looking for something, looking for what they wanted, what God wanted, and it gets jumbled. But that's our job. That's the dots we have to connect. Or can sin be a doorway to humility? Ever find yourself feeling a little more humble after you acknowledge a sin of your own doing? Or just having your mind warped and feel like a walnut when you've been in the presence of big sin that somebody else did and you don't know what to do next? You don't know how to help them or how to make sense of it. Amanda Gorman, the poet that President Biden invited to speak at the inauguration, she's been published a lot lately, and her poetry is interesting. It's kind of a rap type of thing. It's very rhythmic, but it's insightful for a young woman in her 20s. But through some fictions we find fact, she said. In some fantasies we discover ourselves, and then some. Even without living it, a memory can live on in us. The past is never gone, just not yet found. And I find things like that really haunting. Another favorite poet of mine, Rilke, does the same kind of thing. He says, the past is over, or the future is over, the past is yet to come. You know, we're always thinking about where we're going and how we're going to get there and why it's important. And we all of a sudden get blindsided by something in the past that comes up and says, hey, you forgot about me, pay attention. And maybe it's a sin, maybe it's a value, a grace that I just forgot about. And so I don't need to live in the future. I mean, that's not here yet. I don't need to live in the past. but I can learn from it. I can interact with it. And that's what we're trying to talk about today. And one of the ways we have of learning about our past and our present and our future is through literature, through movies, through plays and novels. And I just want to throw up a few of them to jog your memory of some of the very interesting ones that you might have seen, because they're stuff going back from my era. Some of you aren't old enough to do that yet, but some of you are. And so you might remember the movie The Exorcist. At least it keeps getting played on night television again and again and again, because it's intriguing, it's scary, we like frightening movies. But boy, is it scary, frightening, that somehow or other evil can possess us, and it can drive our lives, and it can be the motivating force in our lives. I once lived with the guy who was the exorcist, and we were trying to renovate our chapel at the school we were at the time, and we had done a minimalist job on renovation. We taken out all the statues and put it into a room that could be a multi-purpose room. We could teach class in there, we could show movies, we could have mass, we could do all kinds of things. And it was a nice idea, a good idea in the 60s, and probably still is a good idea, to say we can pray wherever we are. But when we had a discussion on how we were going to renovate that chapel, this priest didn't say anything else through the whole thing, but he said, you know, the prayer to bless holy water is a very powerful prayer. I notice we don't have any holy water founts in the new chapel. That's all he said. Holy water founts appeared. Knowing that that's an important part of our faith. It's a sacramental, it's a reminder of our baptism, a reminder of the goodness that we are. When I was there at the school, I helped out in the drama department. I helped direct a band at the time, and we put on some musicals. Fantastics. I have a feeling everybody in here has seen the Fantastics somewhere or other. It's a sprightly little thing that talks about coming of age of young kids. Everything's bright and glowy and crisp and fresh and new, and they got their parents to deal with, just like the commercial on Progressive or something like that says, don't become your parents. Well, that's the struggle in this thing, is how do I live out of a value system that isn't mine? How do I learn from it? How do I make sense out of it and live well? Well, Harvey Jones and Tom Jones and Harvey Schmidt had another similar play called Celebration. It's the same kind of a thing. And we put that play on when we were at the school. But there's a wonderful song in the Fantastics, and I'm not going to sing it at you because I don't remember it, but there's a line out of it that is perfect for what we're doing. The young woman in this play is dazzled by a flashy young caballero, and she sings, "Take me with you into your world." And that's what both sin and grace do. They take us into a world we'd like to be in, and then we see either the fallacies or the wisdom of it as we play that out in life. It's again, both of these plays are wonderful things if they see a reprise of them somewhere along the line. They're dated, but worth seeing. And so in one sense, Ignatius uses this kind of material in the exercises. We use imagination in the exercises again and again to break open, to step into a scripture passage. But fantasy usually moves us to the unbelievable and impossible, whereas imagination is a doorway into dreams that allow us to explore the possible. I think it's a lovely little definition, because a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to pray with my imagination, it's just fantasy. No, it's a possibility to explore the world we want to live in, see how it could be and is. We took that play Celebration to a convention of high school drama teams. And one of the, we put on the play there for one night, and Tom Jones was there and said, here's what you're going to see. And he had these wonderful costumes from the Broadway shows that he had produced. And ours were terrible little dinky things, and we were all embarrassed. But there was a group from West Virginia, a high school from West Virginia, that came and put on a play called The Serpent. Any of you ever see that? It's one of the most hair-raising plays I've ever seen. It traces, it says here, humankind's encounter with good and evil through biblical stories and American history. So we get stories like Adam and Eve. They look at Cain and Abel. And we see the actors come on stage. The whole play opens up in the Garden of Eden, and there's animals that are just being created, and they're exploring the life that they have and the uniqueness that each of them have. And the kids on stage had a great, great time of embodying these animals and scampering around and doing all kinds of wonderful things. And then Adam and Eve show up, and eventually Cain and Abel show up, and Cain and Abel don't hit it off very well, and there's a lot of tension. And eventually they learn what death is, coming from that tension that they had. And so they discover death. And then the play moves on, and we get pictures of JFK and MLK, the scenes of their assassinations. And we're just pummeled with horror of what happens. And so all of these scenes are about the death dealing that we do to each other that has entered into our society. And this was in the 60s, where that was the news of the day, not history. But history, as we said earlier, has something to keep teaching us. Anyway, all of a sudden, in this scene in the Garden of Eden, the serpent appears, and it's like a collection of all these actors, and they're tempting Eve with getting into her mind and doing some wonderful, and you see what temptation is. And ultimately, or eventually, a bag of apples, a gunny sack full of apples comes out on the stage, and they pour these out on the stage, and there's apples all over the place. And actors are picking them up and looking at them and seeing what they are, and the serpent picks up a few and leads Eve into thinking that this is going to make her like God, give her the wisdom that she needs. And she argues with him and all that, but eventually takes a bite and then offers Adam a bite. And then they look at the audience, and they start moving toward the audience. And one of the best looking ladies in the troupe there came down the aisle. I was sitting on the aisle, mistake. And she sat in my lap with an apple. And I said to myself, I will not. You're going to give me that thing, and you're going to want me to take a bite out of it, and I will not do that. And within 10 seconds, I had almost eaten the whole thing. She was cute. And that's where the humility moment enters in. I will not, but I did it. We've been there, maybe not in that particular scene or something like that, but we said, no, I won't do that. Bingo, within minutes. I usually tell the truth a lot, but every now and then a big lie slips out. And I said, where did that come from? I didn't want to do that, but I did it. And now I have to live with that as part of my history. So what are the root causes of sin? That's kind of what we're supposed to talk about, and you're going to have to fill in those dots, connect those dots, fill in those blanks. You know, is it an apple that got me to the next step, or got me to say yes when I really meant no? Or was it the serpent, the devil? I was looking through I liked photography, and I was looking through some of my photographs, and I came up with this one. It's a cousin, Corey, when he was a little kid, and he found a whole batch of snakes, and he was playing with them. Yeah, ooh, we got a funny little feeling there. They were harmless, you know, they couldn't get their mouths open big enough to bite you, and they had no poison, and they were just fun to play with. But it's kind of a picture of venial sin, if you want. It's fun, it lures you in, you harmless, But those harmless things can lead to other things. Like I said, I found myself in Nagasaki. Before that, I was in Hiroshima, and being a photographer, I had set myself a challenge to take a picture of how life has come back from total destruction. And I was just having a terrible time coming up with seeing something that would say that. And I happened to be at Ground Zero. This is the courthouse that was right where the atom bomb fell. And this is the one big structure that survived and still survives. And it's the centerpiece of their Peace Park. And as I was there trying to take a picture of it, it was rainy, it was a messy day. And all of a sudden this little crowd of kindergartners came through with their teacher, and they were getting a history lesson. And I had my camera bag open in front of me, and they walked by and they kind of were curious, and they looked into the bag, and all of a sudden I just said, "My camera speaks Japanese, but I don't." And the person I was with translated it and gave me time to get the right lens on, and I looked up, and here's the picture. You know, there's life, even after death. And we're still trying to figure out what that means. And we're right on another brink of that kind of a moment happening in our world today. And how do we put all that together? How do we make a difference? So do we think of temptations and sins as places we can fall or fail? Or are they misplaced possibilities to fly and soar? I think I've left this on a sheet of handouts that I'll give you afterwards, and so you don't have to write all these things down. And I know I'm conscious of time here, so I want to move through this a little faster. Or do we see life as a journey filled with invitations, risks, and opportunities, desires that can be resisted or reverenced? There's a beauty in an apple, and we use it for food and nourishment, but it's also got some downsides. Particularly in the story we get in Genesis. You know, it's going to give you some wisdom you never had before. Oh, yes, it will, in a context like this. So, how do we approach sin and evil? We've got a lot of ritual ways to do this. The Jewish people have worked with this for years, and so they've had the practice of getting rid of their sins by putting them on a goat or a lamb and sending it out into the desert. And so it'll be out of their view, and the desert can do with it what it will. But it's a ritual act to rid ourselves of sin. I have a few of you remembered Laugh-In from the 60s, and Flip Wilson used to come on all the time. It just a little throwaway line or insert line all over the place when he got himself in trouble. And he said, "The devil made me do it, the devil made me do it." Well, the interesting thing is, you know, the devil's got no fingers to point. But we can throw our blame, our guilt onto that devil and blame it on him. But usually when we find ourselves doing something like it, it's because we've got a blind spot, something we're not seeing well, and the nature of evil is to keep itself concealed. And so, you know, look as we will, we frequently don't find it, or sometimes it just finds us when we're not looking, and we know the physics of the blind spot in our eye, that there's places we really cannot see. But these are the other ones, the metaphorical ones, the reality that I just miss things. Like, I never knew this, but if you trap bees in a mason jar and don't put the lid on, they won't fly away. They can't see that there's no lid on the top. They keep bumping into the glass. And that's kind of what our blind spots are like. Bill Kane, a Jesuit, who's a playwright, wonderful imagination, just a wild, off-the-wall imagination, but right to the point. He'll skewer you with his insights. And he retells the story of the blind Bartimaeus in his book, within the last year, The Diary of Jesus Christ. If you haven't seen it, highly, highly, highly recommend it, because he goes through lots of different scenes from the New Testament and puts you in the place of the characters that are playing it out. And blind Bartimaeus is, after he comes to see, and he starts laughing all over the place, and Jesus doesn't know what he's laughing about. And it's because Bartimaeus is looking at the people around him who were blind, and now they can see like him. And he says, they don't see how beautiful they are. One of you said that a little bit ago. Sometimes we miss the beauty in the other. And that's the miracle here, that Bartimaeus, he doesn't get physical sight, according to Bill Cain. He got an insight, more in a Hopkins sense of things. So, Ignatius, in his autobiography, talks about one of his root causes of sin. As a young man trained to be to go places in the court system, the hierarchy, the royalty. He says his main downfall was vainglory. Once he got enough perspective, enough distance on what he was doing, it was, I'm going to go out there and, meet the best looking lady in the world, and that she's going to be mine, and then I'm going to lead my troops into battle. And he picked a crazy spot to do that at Pamplona. And it all fell apart. And it was all because of that vainglory. He wanted to see himself in all his glory. I hate this line from Revelation. Because you're lukewarm, I will vomit you out. And so, in one sense, a lot of me, I find myself lukewarm, just kind of going through day after day after day, and not paying a whole lot of attention to what I need to be paying attention to. But all of a sudden, bang, the scales are lifted from my eyes, like Paul says, and I understand. So, when I'm pondering my sins, I might want to be aware of the motivations I have for making such a choice. That's going to give me a clue into my rootedness of my sin. It'll be like a blind spot that's all of a sudden in the spotlight. Marion Cowan of happy memory, I squirmed a lot in her presence because she was my spiritual director off and on whenever we were in the same city before we had Zooms. And every now and then she'd get this crazy little smile on her face after I told her what I was doing, and she'd say, okay, Mike, that's a real good reason for doing that. Now, what's your real reason? I don't like that question. But I ask it to every spiritual directee I've got because she was a damn good mentor and taught me, where to look in the places that I'm not seeing things. So, it seems to me here's a couple of good root sinfulnesses. Our root sin is not noticing the beauty of the creation around us. Notice how that kind of ran through some of the things you were saying today. And our root grace is noticing the beauty in creation and responding creatively. The ball's in our court when we see that, and game on. We have the freedom to make those choices. But sometimes that root sin takes away that freedom or blinds us to what we could do. And so we don't do it. And so reverence is an important thing. How do I reverence the life around me? And my friend Larry Gillick used to say, reverence your resistance. It's going to show you what you're fighting with, where you're going uphill. And that's a good place to go, it's uphill. It's part of our quest. So every now and then we look at dark places in our lives, the emptinesses in our lives, and curse them because we say this is, life is kind of lukewarm here. And yet some of those ordinary places, some of those overlooked places are wonderful. This is a picture of an initiation ceremony in a tribe in Africa. And the initiates, the young men moving into manhood, gather to hear stories by their elders. And they sit in a circle and listen. But those empty spaces in that circle is what gathers them together. Those spaces are really life-sustaining if we hear that story and live with it. And so an author, Louise Erdrich, writes a lot about Native Americans in South Dakota and places like that, a wonderful author, says the only thing that God can do, and does it all the time, is to draw good from evil situations, any evil situation. I don't know whether theologians would always agree with that statement, but it's what she said, and I haven't read that particular novel, but it jumped out at me when I saw that line. That's God's work, is to solve the problem of evil. But God's going to give us a chance to do our own connecting of the dots. And so, Erica Baumeister, in another wonderful novel, it's The School of Essential Ingredients. She's a woman who's going through a divorce and is a good cook, and so she opens up her kitchen to people to come and learn to cook. And the cooking becomes a very healing thing. And everybody during the course of the novel tells their own story, and everybody are nourished by that, what they've heard, in addition to what they've learned to cook. So sometimes the greatest gifts grow from what we're not given. And it's what the people who came to that cooking school, that wasn't their purpose in coming, but that was the gift they were given. And so when we get empty, when we get dry, it's nice to have a nice little short prayer. Gerald Manley Hopkins gives us one at one of his little sonnets, one of the terrible sonnets where he's in a depressed state, and his last line is, "Send my roots rain. Help me to grow." So I was trying to come up with a simple definition of what sin is, and this is what hit me. Sin is the fork in the road on the way to the promised land. But I basically really attribute that to Yogi Berra. Because the fork in the road offers us a choice. And often the choices are ambiguous. This or that. No choice solves it all. But it's a fork in the road, and we've got to decide which fork to take. And Ignatius came up with that same choice. He came up with a very unique situation when he was trying to decide whether to hack the head off of this Muslim that he thought was dismissing the Blessed Virgin. And so he left the choice up to his donkey. And luckily the donkey went this way and the Muslim went the other way, and both lived to tell the story. But as they look back on all of these things, they find out that it's a pretty knotty thing that we've come through. Both N-A-U-G-H and K-N-O-T-T-Y. And I love Pope Francis. I'm not really one for devotional things, but and I don't particularly like most of the statues that we've got in our churches. They're just too pious, and they're just bland. And so this is not bland. It's imaginative, but it's the untire of knots. In our Theologate in Nairobi, in Kenya, has the Stations of the Cross, and this is the like the 12th station or so. They're taking Jesus down from the cross, and it is absolutely magnificent, poignant, powerful. But that's what Our Lady does. That's her role, is to hold us, to comfort us, to be with us when we rise up. But it's right in the middle of the stuff of life, the terrible stuff of life, the sin and the evil of crucifixion. Our church at Seattle University, a nice little chapel that had been built there, has a very, I can wrap this up pretty quick, I think. They have a wonderful Marian statue. Can you believe that's a Marian statue? It's Gracia Plena, the one who is full of grace, and it flows. Her love, her attention flows out all over us. It's a powerful, powerful thing, but it's that's solid granite that he's made fluid like this. And that's what her tenderness can do to us, is somehow give us the fluidity of life. I came across a little booklet, a tiny little booklet, says, "Give me wings to get to the point," is the title of it. And it's a prayer of a 17th century nun. And this is going to be on the handouts that I'll give you at the end. And so it's pretty much impossible to see this, but from your place here. But and these are the little sins that this nun has to confess, and they're wonderful. Don't miss these. One of them here is, "Release me from craving to straighten out everybody's affairs." You ever have a sin like that, or make that kind of a prayer? Pick one more here to read. Yeah, keep my mind free from the recital of endless details. Give me the wings to get to the point. These are the prayers that Cardinal Koenig of Munich in Austria loved. The rest of these slides that I've got up are on the handout that I've got. So it'll be easier and better for you to just confront them down the line, knowing the context that I've placed them here. This particular slide is from Rumi, one of the Islamic holy people, 14th, 15th, 16th century, I forget where, but some wonderful stuff. But talking here about, we're grateful for whoever comes because each person has been sent as a guest, as a guide from beyond. How do we open our eyes to see the person in front of us as that? And how do we see a moment like what happened in the Garden of Eden as a blessing in disguise? It opens our eyes to the reality of our world. And Denise Levertov is another one of these people who does wonderful poetry. If you haven't found her, buy a book or two and read, because to this creature vainly sure, it and no other is godlike. God, out of compassion for our ugly failure to evolve, entrusts as guest, as brother, the Word. That'll be on your sheets, as well as this one from Michael Moynihan, a Jesuit from the West Coast. And he's got a wonderful, unique way of talking about the Incarnation. Who, when families are confronted with calamity, they draw straws. And the Trinity does that. And the Trinity, Shorty lost. And Shorty came to share your plight, your fight, your night, and points you to tomorrow. So, at Vicky's bidding, let's take a little break, and we'll come back and do a little bit more. Okay, here we go again. The handouts that you will receive at the end basically cover both parts of this presentation, and they're not in any particular order. The order is what fit on the page, so I could cram as much stuff on as few pages as possible. So they're just, again, dots, and they're not gonna, when you connect them, they're not going to make a picture. I've taken those kind of tests that, you know, you end up with a turkey or something like that when you've connected all the dots in the right way. No, this is just going to be, you'll connect the dots. So another pop quiz. It's about grace. How do you, what are the moments of grace in your life that really impacted you? And I'm not going to give my list or anything like that, but that's a question to ask before you get into any of these questions that thunder thinker theologians throw at us. You know, how would you answer it in your own words, in your own experience? So, I'm calling this little thing a prelude to part 2, because each exercise that Ignatius gives us in the spiritual exercises starts with a prelude, or 2 or 3 preludes, you know. And the first prelude is to put yourself in the presence of God. Imagine yourself, you know, before the throne of God, or the different ways that Ignatius puts it, or just, I come, I reverence this space, this holy place that God and I will occupy during this prayer period. And so I enter with reverence. And so when you place yourself in the presence of God, where do you find yourself? Is the operative image of God, you're dealing with a judge, a friend, a timeless old man? Does she smile? Find the different ways that you image God and have imaged God in your previous lifetimes and or in your present moment, or what are you hoping God looks like when you can only see God in a limited way? And we're all limited in that way. And the beatific vision is, I don't spend much time trying to figure that out or to make it specific, because I know it's going to be way beyond anything I can imagine. And yet we try it. What are my choices saying my image of God is? Am I always worried about how I'm going to be judged? Well, that's probably got something to do with my image of God. But whenever you ask that question, ask it honestly. Who is this God I'm dealing with? And because the way you feel about being in the presence of God is an indication of how you think and feel about sin and grace. The way you feel about God in this prelude is probably the way you're going to feel about sin or grace. Sin is going to be the most important thing that I have to focus on in my life and get rid of it and master it and all of that. Or grace is surprised, is opening my eyes and heart to new realities. So what's grace? I don't know which character out of The Simpsons this is, but here's his question. Is grace a license to sin? Oh, short answer, yeah, with an if. Long answer, no, with a but. So, everybody's going to hedge on this question, or it's going to be ambiguous, or it's going to be open-ended. It's going to lead us somewhere, that the Garden of Eden, that tree of life in the Garden of Eden led us to. Some type of wisdom that's new and fresh. And poets do that a lot. E. Cummings is a favorite of mine. Have you seen this one? Or read this one? Just says D-I-E, close parentheses, exclamation point, open parentheses, L-I-V-E. That's what we're talking about. There's points that lead up to a point that lead away into other points. And what we're talking about in this sin and evil and grace is moving from death to life. It's like Deuteronomy says, I set before you today life and death. Choose life. Well, of course, that's what we're going to do, but of course, the fork in the road comes. So what are some of the scripture passages that you've learned, prayed about, somebody's given you in a retreat or asked you to reflect on? What are the ones that have opened you to the reality of sin in the world and the effects of grace in your life? So I just picked out a couple of interesting scripture passages that really open our eyes to that. Here's a Caravaggio depicting the beheading of John the Baptist. It's one of the starkest pictures of evil. Not this painting necessarily, but that scripture passage, the beheading of John the Baptist. Here's the one who is the prelude to the Word, and people try to render him wordless. But everybody's focused on their own self-interest here, except John. He knows that he's done his job and it's time to move on. Apologies for this one. It's there's a story behind it, of course. This John is named Matt Rule, a very young Matt Rule, lots of years ago. And he was studying philosophy at St. Louis University. The Dean of Studies was retiring, and he asked what present he would like as a going away present. And he said, I'd like the head of Matt Rule on a platter. So being a photographer and Matt being willing to be led into temptation and sin, we gave him a head of John. They're a head of John, Matt. And anyway, let's get beyond that. Here's, I think, one that's an important scripture passage for me about sin and grace all rolled up into one. It's the prodigal family. Not prodigal son, prodigal family. Because the son here, in asking for what he wants, gets everything he wants. His inheritance. And more. He gets to live with himself in a pigsty. And with the possibility of being healed. It's a wonderful story about how all the different members of the family cope with his request, his being son in that family. Because the other son asks the same question. He just doesn't go as boldly and say, give it to me, but he's wanting something out of this family relationship. And the father wants to give it. And they do it. Because we all desire to have some control in our lives. And I don't know whether you can see this picture, but this is a favorite artist of mine, Brian Andreas. He has a website, or had it, I don't know if it's still up or not, but it's called Story People. And he would draw these crazy cartoons of kind of like kid drawings by kid. And here's this person being wafted away on the breeze in an umbrella. And it says, if you hold to the handle, she said, it's easier to maintain the illusion of control. But it's more fun if you let the wind carry you. And that's both freedom and mistakes that we make. We want control, and yet our eyes get open to a blind spot that we really don't have that kind of control in our lives. So a possible colloquy from an image like this is, protect me from what I want. It's one of Jenny Holster's lines I found on a park bench one time. Protect me from what I want. It's going to get me into trouble. It's going to get me more than I want. It's the Mae West line. Too much of a good thing is wonderful, she says. But again, I have a feeling she learned some stuff in her later years that she didn't know. But there's a corollary to that colloquy. Can I pay attention to my holy desires? I've got desires, and sometimes they lead me astray, but sometimes they lead me to very good places. Friendships, to surprises along the way, whatever they are. I'm sure you can think of a batch of those. So the story of the prodigal family is not a story about failure, but it's a holy journey into reunion, which is always a work in progress. The family comes back together, not perfectly at all. The son who asked for his inheritance didn't ask, what if I fail? What if I fall? But the person like us viewing this says, what happens if you fly? And, well, sometimes you crash when you fly. But sometimes you're able to pick up the pieces and continue on. The things that go wrong for you have a lot of potential to become the part of your gift to the world. Krista Tippett, you've all probably heard her on public radio, and she's into religion and all kinds of wonderful stories about living life faithfully. The mistakes we make have a lot of potential to become gift for others, or draw evil from, or draw good from an evil situation. And God, as Louise Erdrich says, the only thing God can do, and He does it, she does it, God does it all the time, is to draw good from any evil situation. You know, in one sense we might say there's a happy ending to this story. Yeah, but, as Homer would say. But evil's a tricky thing, a funny thing, a wonderful, and I can't say wonderful, but it has interesting consequences. Evil has only the power we give it. I'll just let you chew on that. I won't make a commentary on that. But in one sense, we have power to give evil power, or we have the power to say no. It's not always easy, but we can stand up and do that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read this second one because I'm mindful that you've got other classes to go to after this, but this is on your handout sheet. But it's about paths in the desert. When we wander into the desert, into dry places that seem like they're going nowhere in an endless way, in a manner, it's in places like that, in the place of hunger and poverty of spirit, we're fed by the Word of God. So let's take a quick little trip here to the desert. This is another one of those scripture passages that opens up to us. Jesus being tempted into the desert. Rich, rich, rich story. All the different ways that Jesus is pulled and tugged and has choices put before him. And they're all choices that have something to do with who he is and the context that he's in. You sit in the desert there and there's a lot of the stones around that, you know, if you look at them long enough, they might shift from being a dull gray, or maybe they're brown in the first place, to looking like bread. And you say, what if I knew the magic formula? Or what if I could be, you know, if the world had bread, we could be less hungry. We could feed people and they'd have nourishment. And how can I get into that? And these are the temptations Jesus was facing out there, but it was all kind of context driven, I think. So turn them into bread, put yourself up on the temple, throw yourself down. You've got to, you know angels. Hey, didn't one of them announce your birth? You know, you've got an end here. They'll rescue you. And boy, will that ever be a wonderful show. And the words that the evil one speaks with this artist named Archibus, a Belgian priest who just died a year or so ago, they all look like pieces of a puzzle, but they're scrambled and they're dark and you don't know what they're going to form themselves into. But it's a wonderful way of seeing this. These aren't far-fetched temptations. They're for a kid whose birth was announced and attended by angels, who hung out and played in the temple, not to mention witnessing the creation of the world, who had our own ordinary hungers, appetites, and desires. So when you go out into the desert, what do you go out to see? Well, you wanted to see John the Baptist, perhaps. Jesus went out to see himself, find himself, and to be immersed a little more deeply into this whole mystery of what human life is. And so these are the wonderful pieces of art from the Deloge Hospital, from the Los Angeles Cathedral, from the Seattle Cathedral, and some from old manuscript illustrations. But what did you go out to the desert to hear? And we're back to, who am I? Oh, I am the beloved one because God told me, and God speaks the truth. That's the word that I need to hear. Come, beloved one. Life won't be easy, And there will be opportunities to use your imagination, and I'm going to call you forth into that. And so Jesus calls forth the disciples to put out into the deep. And we have different responses when we're called out into the deep. Peter, when he gets this marvelous collection of a catch of fish, what's his response? It's too much. I don't know how to deal with this. I usually catch a little net full of them. But what I'm seeing, receiving, is way too much for me to handle. And back in the this would have been the mid-70s when we had a general congregation in Rome, and the Jesuits like to write documents. And I'm sure you've probably all heard this little quotation, but they asked themselves, what is a Jesuit today? And one of the key responses that really bowled us over. I was working with the novices at the time, and Leo Weber was the provincial, and he decided these documents were too good to hold on to, and so he broke the embargo and slipped us a copy. And the copy said, a Jesuit is a sinner called to be a companion of the Lord. And it's not just Jesuits, that's us, aren't we? Don't we use that word, companions of Jesus? That's our call. So pay attention to the words you hear and the direction those words take us in. Because before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I must listen to my life telling me who I am. That's what Jesus did out in the desert. Listen to who he was from God's point of view. And that's the basic model of our prayer, listening to God's dreams for us. Now, in the interest of time here, I'm going to skip this next one, reading it out loud, but it's a wonderful story. This is, I'm sure everybody's heard of the New Age author of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Richard Bach. He's written a book much, much better than Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I hated that thing. But this one is about a mechanic who's also a messiah. And he's also a barnstorming pilot. And he keeps a journal. And he lives his life kind of resisting that call to be a messiah, which we all are, he says. We're all messiahs. We just haven't quite opened our eyes and seen it. But this is the opening, some of the selections from the opening pages of this novel, and it's his journal. Like I said, he's a mechanic, and he had grease all over his fingers, so the journal got all messed up and things like that. But read this little story. It's on your pages. It'll be easier to read than my trying to read it off the screen here. But it's just a fine description of what we're trying to do. The book's entitled, subtitled, "The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah." Pretty good for us too, I think. That's kind of a description of who I am, I know. I'll own up to it. But we often cling most tightly to what we least need to hold on to. So read this story. When you get home sometime, let it soak in. A couple of poems here real quick that show our journey into life. This is a poem by Andy Bolen, who is an English, born English, ended up in the Australian province, also lost his leg to cancer when he was like 12 years old, so he goes through life wounded. But he copes with that, and that's his blessing and the evil that he's got to cope with. But he says here in this poem called Pamplona, which is the place vainglory got Ignatius onto the parapets of Pamplona and tried to defend this worthless piece of property, and got his leg blown open with a cannonball. Wherever Pamplona is, you mistake the enemy and overtrust your own boldness. You flourish an outdated flag for the last time, and with style, you're on the defensive. The yells and the roar and the fire are dazzling confusion, and then the long quiet proclaims defeat. Pain tells the soldier his leg is turned to a mess of blood. The wound will heal all his life. Call this Pamplona. Pamplona is whatever wrenches failure into blessing. It's the end of noise and can happen anywhere. Wherever fame goes and style goes, and you're useless, is Pamplona. Only later will it announce a new way of being history. Pamplona is the lifelong beginning of the journey into silence. Worth pondering about, worth praying about. And he also paraphrases some of the annotations in the spiritual exercises at the beginning of the book. They're very loose paraphrases, but he catches the spirit wonderfully well and makes it very personal. Annotation 1, for pilgrims, always limping, strolling, walking, running are exercises in love and prayer. Recognize that as one of the early annotations. You know that prayer can be anything. You know, a stroll in the woods, you know, listening to music. Those aren't the examples that Ignatius gives, but it's just like we stretch and warm up before exercise. We stretch and warm up before prayer. The imperatives of walking. Let's start again, faster. Turn here, stop, go back. Keep moving. Whittle the heart into prayer and love. It can be a whole prayer period there. And places are made holy by their story. The spirit in which you journey to them, receive their gift, and leave them. Here's the center of the whole presentation. If you get this, this is what I'm leading up to, and you can take away with it. But you know this already. This is something you've taught other people, and it's the exercise called the two standards. This is the standard of good and the standard of evil, in reverse order. Ignatius put them, the standard of evil, the standard of the evil one, and the standard of Jesus. Dave Fleming calls it two leaders, two strategies. And basically, here's a thumbnail sketch of that whole exercise. Lucifer's strategy is simple, light-filled and clear in direction. But he opens this whole scene of Lucifer gathering his troops out in the plains of Babylon, and with the smoke and the fire and the confusion of deception and all of that. And he lays out his strategy for attracting new followers. He says, you know, I'm just going to lay out three things for them, and they can take it and run with it, and they will. Riches, honor, and pride. These are the root sins that Ignatius says, beware of. You know, if you got a rich, not necessarily money in the bank or a big treasure chest somewhere, but what is it that makes you rich? Because that's going to get people looking at you and envying you and doing all kinds of things. And that's going to lead you right into blatant pride. Hey, look at me. I am important. I'm worth knowing. You know, whatever. However you finish that sentence, you're hooked. You're signed up under the evil one's standard. And Christ's strategy is exactly the opposite. It's simple, sounds like a paradox. Who would follow this recruitment poster. You know, if you join me, you're going to get poverty. You sign up for poverty. You know, give away everything you got. I have nothing to offer. And he says, no, that's going to lead us to humility. That's going to lead us to a type of honesty, looking at my life realistically. And eventually, I'm going to get the insight that, you know, that's just exactly who Jesus was. He was poor. He was honest. He presented himself as he was. And there's an importance there too. You know, I am the Son of God. But it's not, I'm the Son of God, fall down and worship. No, it's, I'm a good companion. I'll walk with you through life. And that's our identity if we take that on too, and other people can be companions with us and walk with us through life. Sound familiar? We're right there. There's some things that I've heard from various confessors who gave away their secret of being good confessors. When I was in high school, somebody came and gave us a retreat, and he was luring us into confession. And he says, it's simple, you know, it's not frightening. He says, if you say anything like arson, murder, or rape, I'm going to respond the same way. 3 Hail Marys. Penance will be easy. Jack Stokel not Jack Stokel, but Ed Stokel in the Twin Cities ran a retreat house for about 50 years, and he got the guys to come to confession because he didn't want to sit in that box very long either. He says, be brief, be bold, be gone. You know, just get to the point. What's that root sin you need to have forgiven? Another mentor of mine, Ed O'Brien, used to tell us, tell me where you could have sinned but didn't. We're getting to the heart of the matter then. It's, you know, what's going on underneath, behind the scenes. That's the important matter of confession. Not, I did this 3 times, I did this 6 times, and oh yeah, I masturbated 4 times. You know, and that's always saved for the last. You know, no, just tell me where that happened, but you found out something worth knowing. I always like to ask people, tell me something good about yourself. You know, they'll give me their string of things, of sins, and I say, pardon me, can I ask a question? And they get worried, and I say, tell me something good about yourself, and they don't know how to answer that at first. Or every now and then you get a young co-ed that'll come in and boy, they'll tell you all kinds of good things about themselves. And that's good. But it's just a shift of how we look at our sacraments there. Ed O'Brien also says, I'll never waste a moment on a negative thought. It goes nowhere. I used to argue with him about that, but he won. And Marian used to say, drive far from this place any lurking spirit of evil. Whenever we direct retreats, she liked to scatter those demons. She didn't want to deal with them either. And that's wise. So there was a confessor that was known for his long lines of people coming to confession. He said, what makes you, you know, such a good confessor? And he says, I forgive sins. That's why they come. That's why they come. And Greg Boyle, out in California, the guy with tattoos on the heart and does wonderful ministry to gang members out in California. He's got a new book out. And it says, forgive everyone, everything. So what have we learned through our own sinfulness? So reflect on that during this week. You know, values get compromised as one moves towards sinfulness. I don't know how many times I hear in confession, you know, so I talk about this because it's generic and not mentioning any names or things like that, but it's, you know, people keep saying, you know, I did this 2 times, 3 times, and then I said, what the heck, I'll just do it a few more times. You know, I've already got to come to confession for this. What's the difference between 1 and 4? But that's the slippery slide that we get on. That's the little handful of garter snakes. So there's a fine line between sin and virtue, and yet they're worlds apart and total opposites. And if you dig deep enough in Thomas Aquinas, that's what you find. He talks about sin as being the value or sin is the opposite of the value I want to live. Flip it over. And the same thing can be said about there's a fine line that separates a wound from wholeness or holiness. And that's what Pamplona is. The wound that goes all through life pulls us into silence where we can really confront ourselves in a good way. So what have I learned through my own sinfulness? More questions than answers. Ask this question of you: how have my sins, the sins that I've confessed over the years, how have they changed? Am I still confessing the same things I did when I was in college, when I was first married? Or am I getting an insight that, this is more serious. This is what life's all about. This is where grace lurks to be found if I have the humility. Is there any sin you've committed that's made you grateful? Nice little quote from St. Jerome. He said, he told the story of having Jesus appear to him and say, "What gift can you give me?" And so Jerome shows him his translation of the Bible and all of these great things. And Jesus says, no. That's nice, but, I want your sins. Give them away. Don't get tangled up in them. They're not helpful. You've been out here in the desert translating all these years. You should have figured that out by now. But he doesn't put him down. Just says, just give them to me. I know what to do with them. So be grateful for your sins. Tony DeMello says, they are carriers of grace. So pay attention not only to the sinfulness that retreatants are struggling with, but also to the places where the retreatant has been hurt by other people. I think this is an important thing. It's more important than my own personal sinfulness, I think. It's where have I been hurt, and I carry that hurt through life. I was watching the playoffs the other day before the birds disappeared, and this little thing came up on the screen. Did you notice this if you happen to watch the playoffs at all down at Busch Stadium? What do you see in that picture?
Jesus forgives errors.
Yeah, it's a little sign there. Jesus forgives errors. It's a commercial that's being circulated on the internet in lots of different forms, not just this particular thing here. It's on hegetsus.com. It's kind of like the old John 3:16, the guy behind home plate in the 80s or so, the guy in a clown outfit with this sign behind the goalpost. Oh, everybody's carrying it. There's always somebody carrying a John 3:16 sign. But it's basically a lot of people are very upset with this campaign because it's kind of an evangelical push, and people don't like the track they're taking with this. But it's got some very good words in it, very good ideas, and acknowledging Jesus' forgiveness in our life. So Simon and Jesus came together at a wonderful time in their life, and it's a place where Simon found Jesus, met him. It's an ignominious moment of glory, but this little quotation I've got here from Carol Hauslander is wonderful. It's in your pages. Quick family personal story, and I'm way over time. Sorry about that, but this one's important to me. I have a nephew named Rourke, and this is his wife Molly, and their little family a few years ago. Their second child, Graham, is her name, was born with an unconnected esophagus. Had a top and a stomach, but no connection in between. Not good. Well, they luckily had the means and the connections to be able to get a very good treatment, and over the course of a year or two, went through surgeries and many trips to Boston, And eventually the esophagus get reconnected. But her prayer was the important thing during this whole time. Her prayer was not telling God what to do, but it was just a simple, open-ended prayer. Please, God. Left it up to God what to do. And I think this is a wonderful type of prayer to give retreatants, rather than saying, no, God, you know what to do. Well, that's what you were saying here. God, you know what to do, do it. But it's not even do it. It's, be God, let me be me, and let Graham be Graham, however that plays out. Very open-ended. It's like, now she's got another little brother, and she's doing fine. They're in grade school and just doing super. But Hopkins has this wonderful line that says, Father, what you buy me, I like best. Great. The rest of what I've got to show here is just some nice little quotes. They're all on your script, the handouts there. Take them and have a look at them. Just want to get to the last slide or so here. And so, Saint-Exupéry, the one who wrote Le Petit Prince, says, perfection is achieved not when nothing more can be added, but when nothing more can be taken away. And that's a good paraphrase of that standard of Christ. I've given it all away. There's nothing more to be taken away. But it's not that I'm afraid of losing it. It's, I've got you, Jesus. I'm where I want to be. And that's what we pray for in the exercises. And that's what I just got ahead of myself. So, and Pope Francis says, without the grammar of simplicity, the Church loses the very conditions that make it possible to fish for God in the deep waters of His mystery. And that's what he called Peter to, and us too. So, little disclaimer here at the end. My comment on what I've been doing today is, I teach best what I most need to learn. So I put some energy into this, and it's been a fun trip. It's been delightful to work with you. But I confess my sins. I stole these things, a lot of them, from others. But that's how we learn. We have mentors, and that's what you are in this, as companions in this Bridges program. So do it well.